nigga man, nigga man, nigga man. Nigga man, nigga man, nigga man. Nigga man, nigga man, nigga man. Damn nigga man, come mash up the data. Come tickling and a chica put Maya. Come tickling and a chica put Maya. Tickling and a chica put Maya. Tickling and a chica put Maya. Bidi 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 bam 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 bam. Bidi 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 bam bam bam. Bidi 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 bam bam bam. Nigga man, nigga man, nigga man. Nigga man, nigga man, nigga man, nigga man, damn nigga man, come mash up the data. Bam chickling and a chica put Maya, bam chickling and a chica put Maya, chickling and a chica put Maya, chickling and a chica put Maya, bidi 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 bam 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 bam.
A funeral on the tiny Caribbean island of Montserrat, a burial among headstones that bear testimony to a strange past. Because in the graves of this other Emerald Isle lie the bones of Ryans and Rileys, Dailies and Sweeneys, Chewits and O'Garas, names as Irish as the shamrock. But they're not the remains of white Irishmen. Here lie black slaves and their descendants. The story behind this strange legacy is a hidden, or at least a forgotten chapter in Ireland's history. It's the story of slaves who toiled for Irish masters, who were driven by Irish overseers, who rose against those Irish owners. But by an irony of history, many were to die bearing the names of their oppressors, Irish names, still commonplace here today, 300 years after they were first heard on Montserrat. And they're here because carried to the new world were the conflicts of the old and the divisions between Catholic Irish and Protestant English. The first Irish to land on Montserrat were Catholics, expelled from nearby St. Kitts by the British governor. As news spread of a Catholic haven in the Caribbean, more Irish came from Virginia, where they too had been victims of religious persecution. Within the next decades, from Britain and Ireland, more came. Servants, political prisoners, vagrants, men, women and children from among the poor and their institutions. Craftsmen came, and perhaps some too who had been freed from their period of indenture, came to Montserrat in search of a new life. Three centuries on, what is an Irishman today to make of the strange legacy which those early settlers left?
I have a green suit now in my wardrobe, and I bought it because of the Irish connection. And whenever there's the Irish national holiday here in Montserrat, I always put that green suit on.
Some of the other islands are more proud of the English connection because they had English connection. Montserrat is really and truly the only Caribbean island that can boast an Irish connection.
It exists in names, and these are ineradicable, I think. The names of people that tell me that my name is Irish. The names of places, they're indelibly Irish.
Montserrat today presents a bewildering mosaic, Irish names and symbols in an English-speaking British colony, African rhythms in music and movement, America's electronic media reigning inexorably the commercialism of an alien culture onto this third world island, But the story behind this curious amalgam of the 80s is a story which may never be fully told. Historical records are scant. Fragments of information lie scattered in the diaries and letters of planters and churchmen who died long ago. Those first Irish settlers deported from St. Kitts found an island bearing many similarities to their home. It had changed little in the 200 years since Columbus sailed past and gave the island its name, the jagged volcanic hills reminding him of the mountains around the Abbey of Montserrat near Barcelona. Its 39 square miles did not delay his voyage. He viewed it from the sea and did not land. We can but speculate as to the thoughts of the Carib Indians, sporadic inhabitants of the coastal region, as they watched his voyage pass them by. By 1632, when the Irish landed, the island was uninhabited. Below the thick forests on the hillsides, they began to till the fertile lowland soils which produced abundant fruit and vegetables. They brought with them the techniques of tobacco growing, their first main crop. The back-breaking work for that they did themselves. But within a few years, and with the advent of sugar, the backs and spirits that would be broken would be those of black slaves. As sugar prospered, the population mushroomed. At its peak, there were 10,000 slaves. A mixture of the races resulted. Indeed, the lighter-skinned families of such unions have long been known as the Irish families.
When you were a young person...
Since his childhood, Benjamin Chalmers, now Montserrat's communications minister, has been aware of this Irish influence.
Yes, always. Since I was a little boy, I was told that most of the people that I met in the countryside here, the northern part, were Irish people, all in Rendezvous, Davis Hill, Underwood, Nixon's, and Baker Hill.
Yes.
They're all strewn with white people all through the whole area here. They live an ordinary life just like any black people down in the village.
What are the most Irish names that you can think of from this area?
The Allens, that was most popular name in the north. The Sweeneys, the Garras, the Fentons, and lastly the Gibbons.
Yeah.
Also, you can remember to the Blakes. They were living up in the Rendezvous area.
The Blakes were not numbered amongst the Irish poor. Unlike the first settlers, they were wealthy landowners and merchants back in Ireland. Their father a mayor of Galway in 1646. They and other Galway merchant families, like the Lynches, prospered with their Caribbean involvement.
Blake's estate was one of the earliest and most significant connections with Ireland. It made a fortune for Henry Blake, a fortune that found its way to London and to the commercial banks that fueled the English Industrial Revolution. As on their other estates in the other islands, tobacco, the first prospect of a fortune, gave way to sugar, and that meant more slaves.
This estate was bought by Henry Blake, who immigrated to Montserrat about 1668. He was soon to write home, "I am sorry you have hard times, for there is nothing sweeter than a good, plentiful living, which I thank God is not wanting unto your loving brother." He had come to gain a fortune which would bring him home, and he did as he had planned. For all its sweetness, life on Montserrat could not hold on to Henry Blake or his money. He purchased a fine country estate in Ireland. He put money, too, into the London banks of other Irish planter families.
Lovely darling woman,
Although Irish and Catholic, some of these planters found it more beneficial to conform to British attitudes and behaviour. Indeed, many were to become more English than Irish in what was and what remains a British colony. The most impressive symbol of the island's Britishness is Government House. Her Majesty gazing down on its timeless colonial splendour. The house sits in lush gardens with views over the Caribbean. Yet even here in this bastion of empire, the Irish legacy recurs. Carved shamrocks adorn the rooftop, one of the few places where this most obvious symbol of Irishness sits side by side with the Union Jack. The island's early governors were all Irish or Anglo-Irish, the assumption being that they would be better able to govern their fellow countrymen. Indeed, heavy penalties were then levied for drunkenness and the abuse of terms English and Irish used towards each other. Today, Montserrat is Britain's last colony in the Leeward and Windward Islands. Governor Arthur Watson, with his Irish-born wife Mary, may prove to be one of the last in a line stretching back 300 years.
This is true, yes. It's the post of governor of this kind is rather a sort of disappearing breed, if you like, an endangered species.
Well, how British is Montserrat?
Montserratians regard themselves as, you know, people of Montserrat. I don't think they would regard themselves as some sort of overseas Britain, but they're still the feeling that so long as they retain the connection, that it is a British colony. They still use the word. It doesn't have the opprobrious connections that it does have elsewhere.
And this Irishness that exists really in the folk history of Montserrat and is mentioned even today, how real is that? The Irish influence or the Irishness of Montserrat, if you like?
Well, it's very strong. I'm really a poor judge, you might say, being an Englishman. But I think that there's a feeling there's feelings of sort of kinship with Ireland because of the historical connection.
Yes. And Mrs. Watson, you were born in Dublin. You would be in a position to comment on this Irishness. Has it struck you?
Well, first of all, certainly the names, like Riley and Garrow, are very Irish. And so are the names of the waterfalls and springs and towns and things. So that's a real connection. Then we have Goatwater, which is supposed to be like Irish stew, but I don't think it is, but it could have started off like that, you see.
We are the ones to make a better day, so let's start giving.
Could you tell me something about the Goatwater? What's in it?
A lot of spices. And goat meat.
And water.
And water.
They say that it used to be like what we used to call an Irish stew too. Did you ever hear anyone say that?
Sure, you make an Irish stew, but you make it a much better, a little thicker, with some vegetables into it.
I see. And did anyone ever make the other kind of stew?
Sure, I does it. The Irish stew, I does make Irish stew. Hilly.
Hi.
Bring a little pepper for me. Let me put some pepper in this stuff. Get a little hotter.
Which do you prefer yourself?
Well, I prefer the good water, really.
Yes.
For here, you know?
Yeah.
Yes.
It tasted very good.
Thank you.
Cool out yourself, Mary Dublin. Cool out yourself, Mary Dublin. Cool out yourself, Mary Dublin, y'all. Remember, you're no devil. Cool out yourself, Mary Dublin. Cool out yourself, Mary Dublin. Cool out yourself, Mary Dublin, y'all. Remember, you're no devil.
With sugar came slavery. Slavery on a massive scale. Plantations like this one, Galway's, were to be built all over Montserrat. And to clear and cultivate this rough terrain, to plant and harvest the sugar canes, required a huge labour force. Black slaves started work at the age of 4. They were regarded as chattels, listed like cattle as the assets of their plantation. They were, too, subjected to arbitrary punishment. For suspected stealing of cattle, a severe whipping and both ears were cut off. A woman who stole clothes was sentenced to 39 lashes at the pillory, and one slave who was convicted of stealing pigs was sentenced to be cut to pieces.
The remains of the sugar mills dot the Montserratian landscape. They were, it seemed to me, the only monuments to the thousands of slaves who died, who were buried without ceremony or ritual, without a cross or stone to mark their grave. The cost in black lives for the sweetness the newly addicted classes of the mother country sought for their tea and coffee was high. The Irish had continued to arrive. Although a minority among the planters, at one stage they outnumbered the British 6-1 in the overall population. When he conquered Ireland in 1650, Cromwell deported thousands to the Caribbean. No doubt many were to end up here. Some Irish, it seems, were overseers or drivers on the plantations, a view supported by historian Dr. Howard Fergus.
Some of them, yes, would be overseers, because once you had a sprinkling of whites in a sea of blacks, as it were, there was need for a sense of solidarity among the whites, so that manual labor was given to the blacks, and the whites were given sort of sub-managerial posts. So that would be correct.
Would you think that there is anything to this? Perhaps it's a popular belief now that the Irish were more lenient towards the blacks.
Well, I have no documentary evidence for this, but I'm not prepared to devalue oral history. There is such a thing as oral history. Ideas could be handed down. They perhaps carry a different status than something from written document, but the ideas seem to be so widespread, so widely held, that all I can say is that there's maybe there was some truth to it after all.
From being overseers on the plantation to the point at which very many Irish are intermarried with black people, how does that transition take place so easily?
I could say maybe cynically, but truly a number of the black women were attractive, as far as the whites were concerned. But in fact, as Brian Edwards, a 17th century planter historian, tells us, liaison, as he calls it euphemistically, was popular between whites and blacks. There were sexual relationships.
The fact that they left the names, that means they were really mixers. The Irish were mixers. In other words, they never felt that they were more than the black people, because from the moment they started making children with the black people, that shows that they were good mixers.
Yes.
And not only that, they liked the liquor. And when the liquor is in, when the rum is in, the man is out.
there are people in the northern area of the island who are brown, if you like, and who are descendants. Just recently, I've spoken to people who say that their grandparents can remember stories from their people about the Irish connection.
Willie Boy Sweeney, now in his 90s, is one such Montserratian. His recollections are scant, but he does have some memories of his forebears.
Your own grandparents, were they white people?
White people. No white people.
Your grandfather and your
Yes.
grandmother?
Yes. They was white people.
Do you remember them very well?
Oh, man, no, I used to walk with the old man, came down the river to get his skin beer down there, man. He used to tell me all what happened in the youthful days.
In Ireland?
Yes.
Yeah, here.
Their life was very different from the blacks on the
Oh, yes.
plantation.
Oh, yes. They were drivers for the black people.
They were
but
the
the
drivers.
people used to come from Africa to work as laborers.
Yes.
Or the Africans.
And there was the supervisors.
And they would man really send cat lash out to lash the black people to work.
Were there many white people in
No,
this area?
Many white people wasn't here at
Well,
all.
what kind of families were there? What other names would they have?
Some was Allen, some
Allens and
some was weird, all kind of the name of people.
the Gibbonses were here, were they?
Gibbons, yes, the Peter Gibbons was from Ireland. He was a rich man here, Peter Gibbons. Yeah.
When you were young, did people talk about Ireland?
I heard about it always. My grandfather and I used to talk about it.
And what used he tell you about it? What used
They didn't tell me whether they worked there, what they did. I didn't get up to that.
Yes.
Because I wasn't experienced enough to ask them about that side of the war, you know.
But they always talk about Ireland, where they came from.
Right, man, yeah.
The Sweeneys and the Allens of today carry on the occupations of Willie Boy's forefathers: carpentry, boat building, and fishing.
It's a very expensive business because you are making and losing all the time from this fishing business. And our water is very deep, and the fish them is not plentiful like you all have in Europe. But we still make a living, or what we call it, we survive.
Visitors are often surprised that some of these families are indeed native Montserratians.
But just tell me about your own people.
Well, my own people died in Montreal.
And when did they come first?
Ask Jesus to ask me.
And they stayed in Montserrat, in this part of the island. Did they?
In St. Peter's, from Bellon River to Hellgate.
Teresa, has anybody commented ever about your light skin and how you come to be so fair-skinned?
Yeah, well, most people, like foreigners, and during coming here on vacation in the island, they ask me how I'm so clear to most everybody. Well, I told them, well, my foreparents told me I was native from the Irish descendants and that I've lived here with my parents. And my father was a Negro, but my mother come from the Irish descendants. That's how I get my color. Most people that live on this island are from the Irish descendants. And these people who came here from Ireland were the slave people who these people were slaves, and they were the owners that has different sections, like they were the masters of the slaves.
They were the overseers.
Right.
Yeah.
They were the overseers, and after living here so many years, they fall in love with the natives, and they extend their families, and that's how some are dark and some are clear.
I grew up and went to school with them barefooted and felt just equal as them, even though their hair was much silkier than mine and skin complexion was much clearer. And I never felt that they were more than me, and I'm sure they didn't feel that way.
John Riley was foreman at Farrell's mill when it made sugar for rum. It was one of the last to close down. Steam had by then replaced wind and cattle power to drive the rollers that crushed the cane. Otherwise, the process was just as it had been for 3 centuries.
When we're ready to grind, we get men to carry the cane inside. 5 men we used to use with a piece of rope and some wad on the head. We used to make the wad out of banana bush, the dry leaves. Understand? And from that, it goes to the mill and squash it there, which will show you all that.
As the canes were crushed, the brown juice trickled into collecting tanks before boiling in large copper pots. The cane husks, known as bagasse, were used to fuel the fires beneath these coppers. After boiling came cooling, crystallization and draining. Cyril Taylor, manager at Farrell's, also recalls the last days of sugar and how little techniques had changed since the days of slavery.
Men would have to plant that cane with women dropping the cane plants in the field. And then when it came to weeding, that is getting rid of the competitive weeds, that was mostly done by women. At harvest time, well, the men go in with their cutlasses and cut the cane down, and the women would tie it into bundles. Here in the mill, women would be employed more in the yard, like helping to bring the sugar canes to the mill and taking the bagasse from the mill. And by the time they get it outside, both the women and the children would scatter it in the sunshine, drying, and then take it around to the point where she enters the fire hole, as we call it. All your coppers would be boiling and throwing off steam, and your steam pans would be throwing off steam too, and a fair amount of heat would be around.
In the days of slavery, conditions here were dangerous. The scalding sugar stuck like glue if splashed on skin. Limbs and lives were sometimes lost. Accidents at the crushing rollers too brought death and mutilation. Given their conditions, it's hardly surprising that the slaves revolted. It happened in 1768, and significantly they chose St. Patrick's Day, when the planters had come together in Celtic revelry at Government House. But the plot was betrayed and the leaders cruelly executed. So strangely, while the week-long St. Patrick's Day festivities now seem to celebrate Irishness in the traditional way, the St. Patrick's Day revival of a decade ago recalled a very different view of Irishness, according to Dr. George Irish, an historian and student of local culture and folklore.
It started out as a revolt in the 20th century, in the early 1970s, against all those Irish people, including the indentured servants, who saw their identification at that crucial point in history with the plantocracy rather than with the underprivileged. It was a clear racial affiliation. The line was clear-cut. If it was a socio-economic issue, the indentured servants would have identified with the slaves. But because at the moment when they came to the crunch, they chose to fall back on their racial identification or nationalistic identification. I wouldn't want to just put it down as purely racial now. Racial and nationalistic identification with the plantocracy. We felt a little disrespect for that kind of person.
Are we done with, boy?
Not only were conditions for the slaves appalling, but they were denied most forms of recreation. They were not allowed to meet together. They were denied their music and their pastimes. But life among the early planters, too, made few concessions to culture of any kind.
The Irish who came, like the English who came, were really birds of passage, usually, who came to make a fortune, and if they made it, they went back with it. If they didn't make it, they fled at the same time. So that there is no marked Irish input into what I consider a Montserratian culture. In fact, I go further and say that one of the horrors of British colonialism is that they never really made any literary or artistic impact on these societies. It was a purely materialistic society, so that their impact is seen more in terms of sugar mills and houses and plantation structures, rather than in terms of spiritual values and in terms of artistic expression. We have no written record of any Irish people in Montserrat. No novels, no poetry, no feeling, no expression of sentiment, of spirit. The European dances which the slaves imitated, which they saw in the great houses, you know, the quadrilles, the polkas and what have you. When you compare the way an average Montserratian dancer interprets a quadrille, you see very clear differences in terms of body movement, in terms of facial expression, in terms of the whole involvement of the personality. People were not permitted to participate. So they had to eavesdrop and look through windows in order to get glimpses of what was happening. Mere snippets of the performances by the plantocracy within the sacrosanct areas of the great house. And very often what they had to do was to take those little snippets out and reinterpret them in the context of their drums. The British colonial system up to the early 20th century prohibited the use of drums. As late as in the 1950s, when there was an industrial conflict here on the cotton plantations, a judge prohibited the use of the steel band, which is a modernized musical derivation in the Caribbean. In spite of the law, history has proved that the man underneath works out his own ways of preserving his culture. And these drums survived simply because people played them in the hills. It happens so that in Montserrat, being a small place, it was difficult for them not to be heard. But by the time the police were able to get to them, they were able to conceal their instruments and still, after having performed their own ritual and so on.
And one of those instruments seems remarkably like the Irish bowron.
That's quite true. Just the slight differences in the additions that we have on our drums. Now, up to the time that I was about 15, the fiddle and the fife were popular instruments in Montserrat. And we have always attributed them to having come here through the Irish settlers.
What do you think today are the major cultural influences?
The Jamaican and the Trinidadian music have definitely made an impact on Montserrat that is stronger than any North American influence. The calypso is not originally Montserratian. We have our own folk songs in Montserrat, which are very similar to folk songs across the Caribbean. But the calypso per se is a contribution that comes straight from Trinidad. The reggae is a contribution that comes straight from Jamaica. All right? Granted, they have gone international, but we have adopted that. And so to the extent that the calypso now is regarded as one of the primary national musical forms.
Oh, move your money down. This girl make you rock. I know that you know. I come from the beginning, yeah. You jump to the left, way to the right. You wind to the center, try to push to the rear. Oh, la de la line, de la line, la de la line, la de la line.
Today, when the church bells ring, it is for an amazing variety of denominations, many of them new. For a small island and a population of just 12,000, the list is surprising. In fact, no one seems sure of just how many churches Montserrat has. But such freedom of religious expression was not always the hallmark of Montserrat. Although Irish Catholics formed the majority, they were discriminated against here every bit as much as in the Britain and Ireland of the 17th and 18th centuries. Bishop Antoine de Metz first came from Belgium 50 years ago. He studied documents now illegible or destroyed to piece together early church history. He believes Irish priests, coming in disguise, were responsible for building Catholicism, both among the Irish and the slaves.
They couldn't come over officially in their clerical garment. They came over dressed as fishermen or lumberjacks, not as priests, and then they made themselves known that they were a priest to the various estates where the Irish were happy to see a Catholic priest. And so they went to Galway, and I think Father Stritch, whom I like to call a stitch in time, he just came at the right time, and it was still very difficult to have a priest a bit openly talking to the people. Father Stritch was welcome, and he was the one that really took the heart of the slaves. The Irish masters treated the slaves better, I think, than the English masters did. And automatically, the slave, when he was free, took the religion of the master. But they were not so anxious to take the religion of the Anglican master, because the Anglican master had not been so kind to them.
Loosen our tongues to proclaim the great things you do in us, through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, forever and ever.
All the churches have had to come to terms with a Caribbean reality. More children are born here outside marriage than within, yet with no social stigma. In this strongly matriarchal society, women may have several children by different fathers. Yet Bishop de Metz does not condemn this as simply immoral. He says immigration amongst younger men is so high that women far outnumber those remaining. Accepting they have little chance of marriage, many girls therefore seek security by having a child who will care for them in later life.
You must look at it in the proper way. That is not immorality. they're looking for security. The girls know very well there are many more girls than boys. So the girls know we cannot get married. But if a girl has a boy, Mommy will never be hungry. A boy will immigrate to England, to America, and every month, money will come to the bank to let Mommy have her share in the bank.
The decline of sugar ushered the departure of the planters. By 1800, the plantations were already in decline, and the planters had been leaving. Hurricanes, earthquakes, droughts, short-sighted and ecologically damaging farming methods had all taken their toll. Emancipation and the loss of slave labour had been the final blow to the plantocracy. The population, now almost entirely black, was left to construct a post-slavery economy. Limes were their first hope. Coinciding with a world shortage of lemons, Montserrat lime juice was quickly established. A cure for scurvy among sailors, recommended by physicians to rich and poor alike. The name Montserrat became synonymous with lime juice. Between 1881 and 1886, shipment of lime juice quadrupled. The export of fresh limes grew tenfold. But tropical storms continually hit the crop. It was increasingly produced on other islands outside the hurricane belt. Tree disease eventually brought its collapse, and by 1930, Montserrat's days of lime were over. But hopes were already turning to cotton. Once again, the island capitalized on shortages elsewhere. 4,000 acres were soon under cultivation. However, it too gave only a brief respite in economic depression. Attempts are being made to revive this industry. But even for the high-quality material Montserrat is producing today, demand is limited. Exports are pitiful.
Sweet Leonie, my heavenly Mayflowers, I dreamed that paradise were made for two. You're my paradise, so cruel. I dreamt about your blue eyes. Say just because you're mine, sweetly I need my heavenly Mayflowers. I dreamed that paradise were made for two. You're my paradise, so cruel. I dreamt about your blue eyes. Say just because you're mine.
Wait, 8 pounds, 18.4 pounds. Yes, they catch you. Carry on. Lend me to come in.
With a weak economy and scant industry, most Montserratians lead a simple life. But there is hardly absolute poverty in an island where many grow their own fruit and vegetables or keep some livestock. Emigration has long been a feature of this island's life. It is estimated that there are more Montserratians living abroad than at home, and money from those relatives provides most families with additional resources. It accounts for 40% of the island's income. In recent years, tourism has provided fresh hope for the economy, but the approach is cautious. Overdevelopment could spoil the obvious attractions of Montserrat. No crowded beaches, casinos, nightclubs. There are only 2 major hotels. The island does not pursue, nor could it cope with, the package tour market. Property development has been increasing, with clusters of exclusive villas bringing the more selective holidaymakers the island seeks. Some are semi-resident, and there is a small expatriate community living here permanently. The island also has an American medical school. Its 500 students, all from the States, make a significant impact on a population of just 12,000. With the developments of recent years, the face of Montserrat has been changing. A new generation faces the challenge of choosing their country's direction, socially, culturally, politically. Will this generation perhaps be the one which will see the colonial ties severed, see the sun finally set on this last Caribbean vestige of empire? Will the growing tide of American influence perhaps prove to be a final colonization, a cultural colonization? What will be the influence of the growing Afro-Caribbean consciousness? And where does Montserrat's Irishness fit into its future? And if the colonial ties are broken, will a new generation find it any easier to define their identity?
Sometimes I wonder if we do have an identity. I think we're a schizophrenic people. We have a bit of Africa. Of course, plantation life did try to snuff out memories of Africa, the culture of Africa, because that was irrelevant to plantation economy. It was important that people didn't talk their language because there was a fear of rebellion. And as you know, language is a conduit of culture. But still, Africanism survived. Then we had our English education. Some of our calypsos in the Caribbean mocked the English thing. Dan is the man in the van, and so on, by the mighty sparrow. So that our culture is a sort of amalgam.
I always have to come back to this. No matter how radical I am, and no matter how pro-African I pretend to be, or I claim to be, that there is a duality in my whole ancestry. On one side, a strong, dynamic, obvious African input. On the other side, a not so obvious Irish input.
I myself think that one of our Caribbean poets has captured very nicely the dilemma we face in this question of an identity. It's Derek Walcott who questions how choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love, betray them both, or give back what they give. He's recognizing that there's a dilemma, that we can't just forget the English aspect of our culture, and yet the majority of us, the majority is black. So there's the dominant African presence. And I'm not going to try to resolve the dilemma myself.
You may go, 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 may God bless you. You may go, 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 God bless you. You may go, 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 may God bless you. But you'll never find a daddy like me. Sure time changes everything. Sure, time changes everything. You go away and I'll go my there, but time changes everything. Just a change in the scene and the weather. There's a change in the sea and in the weather. There's a change in the sea and in the weather. Dear, but time changes everything.